Welcome back. This is the start of a mini-series where we'll explore Airtable. In this session, we'll be looking at what Airtable does and providing an introduction into Airtable Basis. So let's jump straight into Airtable and see what it's all about. So what is Airtable? Well, at its heart, it's a database tool allowing you to create data structures similar to tables in what Airtable call bases. It allows you to build these bases and extend them to include automations and interfaces, allowing you to do more than you would with something like a spreadsheet. Due to these capabilities, it's far more powerful than the likes of an Excel spreadsheet, enabling you to create apps, share data, and integrate with many other platforms. And to top it off, it's also no code, making it easy to build something usable for your business. So, what are we going to build in this session? Well, in this session, we're going to build an integration project management solution. What this will enable us to do is it will enable us to build a platform to create our integration projects in, to manage the tasks for those, and to also manage the people that will be responsible for delivering the integration projects. So how does that fit into this session and our concept of basis for Airtable? Well, firstly, we need to understand what entities we're going to need, what basis, in order to store the information for this potential solution. So firstly, we mentioned that we're going to be having integration projects. So if that's the case, we're going to need to be able to store what is known as a project within our solution. So we've got a project base. Then from this, we're also going to need to be able to manage the tasks that are associated with the project or the deliverables. And then on top of the tasks, we're also going to need to represent the people who will be completing those particular tasks or potentially managing the particular project. So now we've got this understanding, we need to understand the relationship between these and the data that we'll be storing against each potential base. Now again, a base, as we've talked about before at the start, is pretty much just a table. And then you've got columns that you can store information about each of those particular objects. So for a person, if we're going to start here, what we're going to want to store very simply is a name. We're then going to want to store something like email address. And we might, off the back of this, then want to store things like a type. So when we talk about a type of person, we could be talking staff. We could also potentially be talking about a contractor. And we may have some other types of person that we want to store as well. But for the moment, that should be sufficient. From here then, we also want to potentially store the role. Now, potentially our task here, we're going to have different things that are going to need to be completed around a project. So that could be, we've got some development. So we're going to need a developer. We may also want an integration lead. So they may be working with the offshore resource and basically will be running the development side for this. And then you may also want a project manager. Now there may be other types of roles you want to store there as well, but for this example, I think that should be sufficient. So that's our person. We then need to think about what we want to store when it comes to our project and the tasks. So let's have a look at the task first of all. So again, every task, we're going to have some sort of a name. So we'll have like the task name here. We then might also want to have an area for some notes. And then from this, we're going to be saying that we want to have an assigned resource. So this assigned resource would be a link back to our person base. And again, obviously a task is only existing when it belongs to a project. So we're going to have a task that belongs to a person, a task belongs to a project, and then we're probably also going to need to look at who manages this project. So we're potentially going to have a person that will be owning responsibility of the project as well. So now we know this, what we want to then think about is the link between those. So we're going to have a assigned resource. This is going to link, as we've just discussed, to our person base. We're then also going to need to consider that we're going to have a project that's going to be, this task is going to be assigned to. So again, that will obviously go to our project base. So let's just add this on here just so that we're being very, very clear. Project base. And then on top of that, we then need to think about what else we want to know about our task. Well, I would say we'd want the role required. So is this a developer? Is it an integration lead? Whatever those roles are. And then we can choose our person that we'd allocate based on the role required for this task. We then need a status. So is it not started? Is it in progress? Or is it complete? Something else that will be really key is the start date. We definitely need to know that. So we're going to have our start date and our end date. And then I think it would be useful if we have our duration. Now that would be a calculated field based on the difference between the start and the end date. So I think that represents very well our task. So from this, we then need to look at what do we need to store around a project. So again, everything needs a name. We probably then also want some sort of notes, the ability to have some notes at project level. Then, as we discussed earlier, someone needs to own that project. So this is going to then link back to our person base. We then likely will want to put some sort of document against the project. So we might have some sort of RFQ document. We could have some sort of signed contract maybe. Whatever that is, we want to be able to store that against the project. And then from here, we want to look at things like, I would say, the start and end date. So what's the start date and what's the end date for the project? However, these potentially could be considered roll-up fields. So in our terminology and the way that Airtable works, a roll-up field is basically like a lookup. So you can kind of look up on another table and do some calculations based on that. So our start date for the project would potentially be the minimum start date for the task that's associated to that project. And the end date would be then the maximum end date. So that would give you an idea of when the project, well, when it needs to start and when it will obviously be completed by. So we're going to say those are going to be calculated fields. We then would have duration. That's going to be calculated based on the difference between the min start and the max end date. That will be calculated and stored on a project basis. We're then going to have a look at things like we might want total tasks. That'll be a good thing to have on here. So that'll be some kind of again, a calculated field based on the total number of tasks that we've actually got. Now, when we're talking about projects and managing projects, what would be useful is to know how complete that project is. So we know the start date and the end date. We then want the percentage that it's complete. So in order to do that, we'll then need to do a calculation that'll be based on the tasks. So we can go, give us a percentage of completed tasks based on the total tasks. So what we're saying is give us all of those that are complete based on the total tasks here. And then on top of that, we probably want to have a look at things like the percentage of tasks assigned. So if we're creating this project at the start and we're going to be creating a project and multiple tasks, we may not actually have a person available to assign. So the percentage of assigned tasks might be quite useful at project level in order to manage this. We then might also want to have a look at the number of tasks that are assigned or unassigned. So we can look at the percentage of tasks assigned, and we might even want to look at things like what's not assigned. So We've got the number of complete, the number of tasks assigned, or the percentage, sorry, of tasks assigned. We might also want to look at the number of tasks assigned, not just as a percentage. So we're going to have number of tasks assigned and the percentage of tasks assigned. And then we'll get a better idea of, okay, are we fully assigned? If we're not, then we need to look at what resource we want to allocate on there. And I think at the moment, that's probably everything that we want to create with regards to this project base. Now, all of this can change. When we go into Airtable and we start building this, we can start changing a lot of these fields. We might think, actually, this is useful, that isn't useful. And we can start looking at that when we build the solution. But I think for the moment, this is a very good as a basis for this. And then we can go in fairly shortly and create the basis. Now, before I go into this, this particular session is around basis. So these are, in essence, the tables. But we do have to bear in mind that within Airtable, we also have automations. And these can be scheduled, or they can be based on sort of data entry. So that could be data coming into a table. It could also be via some kind of form or interface. So we've got automations there, and we'll cover that on a separate session. And then also we've got interfaces. So bases are like going into a table within a database and start entering that data. That is not how we generally expose data to our users. With this, we want to be able to create some kind of maybe reports, and they could be interactive. We may even want to look at some forms there as well. And again, once we've covered the basis in this session, on subsequent sessions, we'll look at an automation session and also an interfaces session as well. And if we're thinking about what we do with this particular project, we can start thinking about what kind of automation we might want to do. You know, we could set up an alert for late projects, unassigned resources, when we change someone that's assigned against a task, when we take someone off. There's a plethora of different things that we can do with regards to automation. And in Airtable, it's incredibly powerful, which is why I've split this up into separate sessions. So let's start now. Let's jump straight into Airtable and start building our basis for our integration project management solution. So we're now logged into Airtable, and we can see that we've got a number of different workspaces. So a workspace is a way of grouping elements to a particular project. In this case, we're building our integration project management solution. So we should probably create a new workspace for that. So in order to do that, we can just hit the plus sign here and we can name our workspace. So let's call this integration project management solution. And there we go. So we've now got this new workspace. From here, we can then start building the elements we need for this solution. So we said before in the previous part that we've got basis, we've got automation, and we've got our interfaces. What we need to do first of all is create our basis. So we can hit create here, and we can basically start from scratch. We can also use some of the AI where we can basically ask it or give it a description for the type of project solution we're going to create, and it can do a lot of that for us. What I want to focus on here are some of the core aspects and core elements we need to create, and I think we're best doing that starting from scratch. However, after working through this tutorial, you may want to look at the various AI elements, and that may speed up some of this process. But for learning, I think it's always good to start from scratch. So let's do that now. From here, we can then basically create our tables within our base. So our unnamed or untitled base here, let's just call that basis. And then we've got our various tables. I just want to jump back out of here so you can see what that's actually created. So what we've got now is we've got our integration project management solution. And within here now, we've got our basis. So we can jump into here, and here we can create our various tables. So our first table we want to create is going to be our person. So what we can do here, we can literally drop this down. We can edit or rename our table. And here we're going to call this person. Now, whenever you create a new base, a new table, you will automatically be provided with some default fields here. So a lot of this won't mean too much for us in terms of a person. However, a person will require a name. So we've got a name here. So we can start entering various elements in here if we want, or we can basically add all the various columns and then start entering the data using just the grid view. So we discussed earlier, we want a name. I'm going to literally delete these additional fields, and then we can add in or create the fields that we want. So first was a name, second was an email address. That's going to be a single line, so that's fine. So we can have that created there, single line text, and that's fine. We're going to create that field. Next, we wanted the type. So this is going to be the type of person. So whether it's staff, whether it's a contractor, etc. So here we want a single select. And when we do that, we then have an option within Airtable to add the different options we want available for that drop down in essence. So here we're going to go staff and contractor. Now, there are options here to turn on and off color coding. I think anything with some kind of a cue for what the types are, so the color coding there makes it a lot easier to see, determine, and quickly identify the different options. Even though in this instance it's only 2 options, if we have multiple, I think the color coding is quite useful there. So we can then hit create field, and when we go in here, we've then got the option to select staff or contractor. Now we're then going to add in our role. So the role here, again, it's going to be a single select, but we'll have a few more options here. So we might have, for instance, a developer. We might then also have our integration lead. We might then also have our project manager. And there may well be other options here, and we can always come back in here and add additional options if we wish. So we've got that there. We can then hit create field, and there we go. If we wanted to create a drop down with multiple selectable options, we can do that from that particular type. So on the field type here, you've got single select, multi-select, checkboxes. There are quite a number of different types of fields we can add. However, for person, that is the core elements that we want to be able to store on a person. Okay, that's great, Luke. We now want to add our project. So we want to create a project. So if we want to create a project base, we just need to hit the add or import. We're going to create from scratch. However, it's worth mentioning that if we've got some data that we already want to create something from, so whether that's a Google Sheet, Microsoft Excel, or a CSV, then we can import from another source. We can even import from another Airtable base as well. So it may well be that we've built some sort of test project there. We now want to build it from scratch. We can do that and select that as an import source. We're going to start from scratch. So now we do that, we can then give it a name. So we're going to give it a name of project, and there we go. So from here, we want to create our project name, which we've got here. We then want to delete these additional fields, and we can start adding the fields that we want on here. So we want something for notes. So that's going to be long text, and we can create that. We then want the ability to have an owner. So we can select add here, call this one owner. And this we want to link to another record. So to do that, we select this, and we then want to select person. We can, as part of this, allow multi-linking, which would mean you could select different people from our person data source there. We don't in this case. We're going to have one owner to one project, and then we can hit create field. When we do this now, it will then ask us what lookup fields we want. So what other fields would we potentially want to include in this project table that would link to our person? So we'd want the name. We might likely want the email address because we might want to do some alerting off the back of that. If a project's overdue, we might then want to send an email based on that. But if that's the case, we would like to have the access to that data from the project table. Whether we want a role or not on there or the type, I don't think that's probably necessary, but we can come back in here and add that later if we so wish. So we're going to hit add fields. When we do that now, we then have an owner that we can select. So if I go back to person, we probably want to populate this with some data. So I'll add myself in here. We can then add, for instance, an email address. So let's just make that up. We then can select a type. So on here could be a contractor, for instance. We can then go integration lead, and that's it. This is just telling us the projects because we've added, if I jump back, we've added the link. The link is also then on the child base. So in this case, the person. So we're saying a project can have an owner who is a person. And that means when we're viewing persons or people within here, it will display the link in projects. So let's then also do a John Doe, and then he can have his email address. Again, we'll just put this in on here. We might then go, well, actually, that's a member of staff, and they're a project manager. And then we can do let's do a Jane Doe, for instance. And then we can put an email address in here. And then we can go, well, actually, they're also staff and they are a developer. So there we go. So we've got our people set up. So that now means when we go onto a project, we can then add in our owners that are going to be on there. Now, generally, an owner would be, in this case, a project manager. And we can filter this so it's only project managers. So when we go onto our edit field, we could look at putting some filtering on here based on condition if we want. Now, at the end of the day, we might have a integration project that's being led by somebody else. So it could be a developer. It might be a slightly smaller project. They don't really need a full project manager. So we can just leave that as that is. So we've got now the link to the owner on that side. What we then want to do is add the other additional fields in. So to do that, we then want to start creating the other fields. So here we also said we wanted a document. So it might well be a signed document. It could be a bit of a requirements document for this particular project. Let's add that in. So we're going to select attachment, create field, and there we go. We've got our document there. Next then, we might want to have a look at things like the number of tasks, how many are assigned. But to do that, we then need to create our task base. So I think these are probably all of the key elements that we need around a project that aren't calculated off of the linked tasks. And we haven't created a task yet. So we can start looking at that. What we're going to do is we're going to create a couple of test projects just so we've got some data in here. So we could have a map force project maybe for, let's say, for Tesco. We can then put some notes in here. So it could be, I don't know, install and set up for map force. And we can put some more details in there. We can then go, right, we're going to have an owner for this, and that's going to be John Doe. And there we go. And immediately it populates the linked fields. I'm going to move this way just so we've got the ordering on here. And then we can also potentially put a document attachment in there as well. So we can drag and drop files. So I can just grab a test file that I had for this particular project. So we've got a project document, and we can drop that document within here. So we've got a project brief document that we've dropped into our project. So we've got that there. And we might want to create a couple of others as well. So we might have a dovetail project for, let's do, let's do that. So dovetail, and that could be for, I'm using supermarkets as an example here, first thing that comes to my head. So for Asda, and this could be some sort of POS solution, point of sale solution there. And then obviously we can have that assigned to a particular owner as well. So in this case, we might go, actually, yep, John's going to own that as well. And again, we can drop our document for that in here as well. And then we might have another one, which could be a, let's say it's a framework update for our internal solutions. So we can go, well, that's actually internal. And that, because it's more sort of development, we are having the developer, Jane Doe, they're going to own the detail for that. And there may or may not be a document for that. So we've now got those set up. Now let's create our task table or base. So we can, again, start from scratch. This we're going to call task. We can then hit save, and we can start creating our elements for our task. So in this case, we're going to have the name of our task. We're also going to have some notes. So we've already got the notes on there anyway. I'm going to delete these out just so we can do these from fresh. We then might then have our assigned resource. So that's going to link to another table, in that case, our person. We're going to allow one, again, it's going to be one-to-one. So a task is allocated to a single person and a project is owned by a single owner. So we've got that. We can then hit create. And in the same way, we're going to have our name, email address. I would say maybe the role on there would be useful. And there we go. So then we can add those. So we've got those linked fields. On top of that, we probably also want to have a type. So this will be the sort of, or the role required. And again, this is going to link into a single select, which is going to need things like whether it's a developer, whether it's project manager. Even though the project manager is managing the project, they may have some tasks in there they need to do themselves. And we might even have, let's say, the integration lead. So again, a similar drop down to the one for our person table. And we could potentially have it so that we create this as a separate base, and then we reference that in here for both of these. So it's we're not duplicating. In this case, we're just making this really straightforward. Create that, and we've got the role required now. So we've got a name for our task, we've got some notes, we've got the role that's required, the assigned resource, which would be selected based on the role. So we might want to look at limiting that potentially. So we can go, well, actually, let's edit this and do it so it just filters for those on that particular role. It just depends what we want to do there. And then from this, we then want to have a look at the status. So we do want a status for a task. Single select, and then here. So this will be not started, in progress, and then complete. Now we've set up the status, we probably want to look to set up the start date. So let's do a start date. We can then find the date. We can look at what kind of date format we want to display. I think it's probably quite nice to have a friendly display on the date. And then we can hit the create field. We can also look to do things like default the date as well. But let's just hit the create date. Create field. So we've got then the end date. So here we can then select date again. We'll have the same format here, and then we can hit the create field. And again, that's then going to create our end date. Now let's add our duration field. Now to do duration, we need to do a calculation. We will do that using the formula field type. Here we can then start adding things like averages, multiplications, etc. Here we want to do the difference between two dates, the difference between our end date and our start date. So if we start typing date in here, we'll start getting not only the field names that have got date in them, so in this case the start date and end date, we'll start getting some date formats or functions that we can use. So here we want to do the difference between two dates. So we've got date time diff. If we select that, it will then tell us that if we take a two dates, we can then pass a value through and it would calculate the difference using that unit or that specified unit. So here what we want to do, we want to take our end date. And again, all of our fields that we reference are going to be put in braces. So then we want our start date. And then we've got to provide our value for units. In this case, we want days. And this here will give us our result. So if I do create field, it will give us our result. However, we've got NAs, so non-applicable here. If I select a date, so we're going to go in here, we're going to start entering something. So if we go start date the 3rd of March, end date of the 24th of March, there we go. We've got our duration. Now that works well for when we've got a date, but actually where it doesn't work well is when we don't have the dates populated, like we're showing here. What we can do is we can clean this up a little bit. We can look at adding some logic in here. What we basically want to do is we want to say if the start date and the end date are not populated, then we want to have a duration of 0. Otherwise, we use the start date and end date to calculate the days difference. So to do that, we use a very simple if statement. We're going to say if, and then we're going to use an and function. And we're going to say if the end date with a comma, because we're passing the different values to the and function. So, and the start date. So we're saying we want the end date and start date to both be populated. So if they're there and they're populated, we can then do our function. So I'm literally just going to cut this out and drop that back in. And if they're not there, we want to return 0. So let's save this. And now we get our 0, 0. And then let's test this. 4th to the 10th, we get our 7 days for the week. And again, if we do a couple of days here, again, it's going to update that. So this now calculates our duration correctly based on the dates being provided. And if they're not provided or fully populated, we've got a start date, not an end date, or an end date, not start date, we don't know what the duration is. So the duration is 0. So that is how you can use calculated fields. So now we've got this set up, what we need to look at is we need to be able to link this. Although we've got the assigned resource, we've got the idea of a task now that belongs to a resource. But what we don't have is it belonging to a project. So it needs to belong to a project. So what we're going to do now is we're going to add a field here, and we're going to add the project that it's linked to. And then we can select on here the project. So we're going to select the project. We're going to have a single task being linked to a single project. Again, we're making this quite straightforward. And then we're going to be asked what additional fields we'd want to pull over. So in that case, we'd probably want the project name. We likely would want to know the owner, and we'd likely also want the name of the owner and the email address. So if we just include that anyway, we can then do that and it will pull all of those fields through. So we can see on the right here, it's got the name from the project, the owner, etc. And then we can look at ordering this just by clicking and dragging how we want. So we might find actually it's really important that we want to see the notes, the role required, the assigned resource and the project. And then we might also want to see, more importantly, some of these other aspects as well. So we might want the status, start date, end date, and duration. They might be quite key as well. So we might look at moving these further up on the left here as well. And again, we can do that quite easy by clicking and dragging, highlighting and dragging through as well. Now we've set the task table up, let's look at adding some tasks. So we've got various different projects. We've got our MapForce project. So let's create a couple of tasks for that. So we might have one around planning the interfaces. And we could say that that role is an integration lead. We're going to assign a resource to that. We'll assign Luke. We're then going to assign it to a project. We know it's the MapForce project. And we can go, this is in progress. And the start date for this is the actually March, aren't we? So we go to 1st of March, and then we can go. The end date is the 7th, for instance. So we've got our duration there. That's fine, and we can see here everything else is then just pulled from the other bases. So it works really well. We can then have develop interfaces, and the develop interfaces is then going to be a, let's say, a developer piece of work there, and Jane Doe is going to be doing that. That's linked to the MapForce project, and that's not started because the planning hasn't been done yet for that. And we could say that they're allocated to start it from, let's say, the 10th, and then we're going to have a couple of weeks for that. There we go. We can then have a look at the doing a couple of tasks, maybe, or a task for the dovetail one, POS solution. So we could do, it could be some sort of requirements gathering on there, and we might go, actually, we're going to give that to the integration lead to have a look at. And that's then linked to our project there. And we can go, that's not started, and it's planned for, let's say, the 17th of March. And we're going to give them a week for that. So there we go. So we've got a couple of tasks set up there. So we've got our data now, and we've got our projects and our person table set up. And you can see here that you can see immediately we've got the links being populated in the same way that our tasks pull the parent information around the resource allocated, the person, and also the project. So we've got the project name, the owner, etc. In the same way as that, as we're adding tasks, the link back to project, or the actual project it's allocated to, this starts building up as well. So bases are really strong and powerful in order to provide that visibility when you start linking them together. Now, something we want to cover on here are kind of views. So what we might want to do is, we've got these different bases, we might want to give different views on this data. So for instance, our person, if we duplicate this, every table or every base will have its default grid view. Now here we might want to create an employees view. Now what that might be, it's a view where we've got a filter set up automatically for the type, and that's set to staff. So there we go. So immediately now we've got two different views. We've got the grid view, and now we've got a, in essence it's still a grid view, but a view that provides a default filter. Now for tasks, we can get a little bit more interesting with that. We can duplicate this, and we can go tasks by project, for instance. And what we might be doing here is we might look at grouping this. So we could potentially group this based on project, and we can get a very good view here of what this looks like. And we can start having a look at totals, etc., and things like that. But really, we're looking at just those sort of views. Now, these are really good because then you can basically create these views, and you can start adding them into things that you can use later on around interfaces. And we'll be covering that in a separate session. But you can see here we've got our counts, and we can start collapsing groups, etc. here. We've got a lot of control. Again, you can still use this to add various tasks and things in here. So it's still useful for that, but it becomes easier to see. So with this view, we can actually, once we've created our project, do all of our task assignment here, and it will be done automatically because you're doing it at that project level. So it'll be very straightforward to use that. Now, although we've set up these bases and the data within it, we can provide and share out the access to the base. But we don't want to do that. That's like handing over the sort of keys to the safe, so to speak. What we want to be able to do is add interfaces that enable a user to create a new record and to get views on statuses and maybe like a dashboard view and things like that. So we can provide all of that in our interfaces, and we don't really want to be sharing the basis access, the underlying database in essence, to our users. We just don't want to. It's not pretty. We can make it look pretty, but really it's quite a low-level way of entering data and accessing this. So we'll be looking at extending this and creating interfaces in the next session. And then we'll also be building on top of those interfaces and providing an understanding on automations and how that works within Airtable as well. So if you subscribe to the channel, as soon as I look at publishing the next session, which will cover interfaces, which will be in the next week or two, you can then see how we would look at building interfaces in order to provide that on top of the base view or the base database within Airtable. Thank you for joining me during this session. Hopefully it's been useful to give you an overview of how bases are used within Airtable and a good introduction to how Airtable is used in order to build and link your data. Please subscribe, as I'll be looking at publishing subsequent videos on interfaces and automations within Airtable. Thank you.